Okay. Um, Anytime I teach a course, I like to bring in a little bit of the history of the subject. I think a lot of us think history was yesterday. I did, certainly most of my life, and I still do. Hard to think about things that happened before we were born or maybe before we became cognizant of what the world was like. But I think it's important to kind of, bring some perspective to that and to say, many things that we're talking about today are really have been around for centuries. We're not anything new, maybe new techniques, maybe new ways of talking about it, but in reality, the questions and the things are have been around. Also, I think for us, particularly in genetics, that as we read papers, one of the things we're going to do throughout the semester and talk about things is that there's a lot of techniques that have been around that have been used. And I think you at least have an understanding when you read a paper, okay, that's the technique. Or when a paper says, well, we do it this way now, and in the past they did it this way. Well, what was that way in the past? You at least have a little understanding of that. So we're going to talk about some human genetics methods that have been used up until the current ones. And then we'll talk a little bit about, okay, what's going on today. All right? So let's start out with really thinking about human reproductive theories and a little bit about genealogies, okay? Those are the first things we'll cover. So what about these? Well, I use this in general genetics, and we use it all the time. If we go back and we think about history, human history, okay? Recent data suggests that humans, Homo sapiens, has been in South and North America for at least 30,000 years. Homo sapiens itself is at least, the species is at least 100,000 years old and probably older than that, 150,000 maybe. We, of course, got close ancestors that are beyond that. But for most of that time, really, there wasn't a lot of thought about genetics, in the sense that we didn't write things down or transmit things. We simply tried to hunter-gatherer or do our things to live, farm or whatever other things or technologies being developed. And that's not to say there wasn't some thought about it, right? This is the little Venus here that's sitting here. This is Venus of Whippledorf. This is a clay one. There's ideas that there were lots of probably wooden ones around or things. And it's obviously a pregnant female. It's a female form. And the idea here was that this would be maybe an idol or something that would be used to maybe encourage reproduction, right? Form. And yeah, think about it. I mean, this one's 22,000 years old. There's some probably much older than that. You think about what was going on. There really wasn't a very strong connect between the reproductive act and the parturition, the birth. Right? Particularly in humans, we've got basically a 9-month cycle there. So, and it can be several months before a female starts to show any real signs of pregnancy. And so there's a reproductive event at some point, and 9 months later, there's a child. Well, human systems, that's whole seasons of what's going on. So really wasn't a clear understanding of even the relationship between the act of insemination and the parturition. So that led to lots of things. This is these Whippledorfs, the Venuses often have like blood on them. We thought that menstrual blood was important, or the humans obviously did. So they're rubbed with menstrual blood or rubbed with other things to try to stimulate, whatever deity that was at the time. Earth Mother or whatever to make, bring forth pregnancy. Now, of course, put into all of this is this idea of spontaneous generation, right? The idea that things just occurred. And again, because you have this complete disconnect between the act of procreation and the actual act of parturition, you sit there and go, well, oops, I'm pregnant. What happened? Well, some deity favored me, or something happened, some positive event in my life that made this. And we took that and we said, well, okay, must be some spontaneous generation that's going on. And it wasn't until the late 1850s that this whole idea was finally put to rest by Pasteur. Now, of course, spontaneous generation, we didn't think that humans just magically appeared in the 1600s or by these periods, but the whole concept that you could morph things. I mean, this whole idea back in the Middle Ages of morphing base metals into gold and all that was really part of this whole construct of spontaneous generation. Now, a lot of thought had actually gone into it that was counter to this. The Greeks, who had dissected individuals, they dissected humans and other organisms, and looked at these things, realized that there was a relationship. One of the important things for us is the relationship between form and function. And that's actually quite important in genetics, because when we start talking about the end product of the genetic process, going from transcription, translation, et cetera, to make a protein, the way proteins work is by their function, right? Their function is based on their form, right? And mutations change their form will change their function, sometimes better, sometimes worse. But the form and function are important. But of course, they were thinking of it in terms of human anatomy and human systems. The Greeks had the idea that males provided the form, okay? So this product that was being introduced was actually the full individual. Females simply brought the form to life. Okay? The concept of blood was important. This was the idea that, we had blood, things flowing around in our blood, venous system and arterial system, collecting in the reproductive organs, and somehow this played an important part. And there's little things that came out of this that are still around. Left and right theory, because we're bilaterally symmetrical, we're split down the middle. Okay, we've got equal on one side or the other. Our ovaries are, on one side or the other. Even the uterus has a right and left side. The basic idea was if after insemination a female laid one way, you could have a male, and if you laid the other way, your chances of having a female were higher. So different societies actually had rules, about, okay, we've got our daughters are valuable or something, we get dowries for daughters, so we want our wives to weigh this way. Our sons are more valuable because they are individuals that mine these, they help us farm or they help us do stuff. So you want to play the other way. So there's actually these rules written in various places about what, how you should function. Anyway, we had this whole idea of spontaneous generation. We had this going back a couple thousand years, these ideas of all these things put together, but no real true understanding of the genetic process that led to life. Now, we did build things like these genealogies, right? Here's one from, taken from Old Testament of a Christian faith. And this is one where you've got Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve, and they're all linked together somehow to show their relationships to fairly early descendants of these individuals over time. So this is essentially just a pedigree, right? A family tree. And you certainly see more complicated ones. This is one that's brought about from taking Adam and working through all the major prophets and down through Abraham, and Abraham leading down to both the production eventually after long periods of time to Muhammad, okay, the primary prophet of the Muslim faith, and to Jesus, which is just a different routing, who's a primary prophet or primary leader in the Christian faith, of course. So all coming back from, a very common individual, common ancestral form here, even though it's many, many, many generations involved. So that put a lot of work into trying to figure out who begot who and how all these ended up based on looking at writings and historical functions. But these are, basically this is not only trying to figure out how human reproduction occurs, but how they relate to each other, right? That understanding, and it's a major concept to think about the fact that something came from something else, right? It wasn't spontaneously generated. There was an individual who was involved, another individual, and they together produced another individual, et cetera. And there's links going back. That's completely different than just an individual here who suddenly magically gets pregnant and produces a child, right? Or something. There's some kind of a real connective relationship that goes on through this. Okay. Well, it obviously not just historically, but in the far past was important, but it's also, really been important in societal systems. There's the peerage of England, Scotland, lots of places that have kings and queens and leaders have what are called the peerage. And the peerage is that you are, you can be a duke or an earl or whatever. It's part of the peerage. And these individuals were the leaders, and they were the leaders primarily because they had some ancestral link back to someone that was a king or queen or someone that was important. It's called a peerage. And in fact, there's political systems. So if we go look at the parliamentary system of the UK, there's the House of Lords and the House of Commons, right? And the House of Lords originally was the peerage, right? And now you can now be put as a lord in other ways. You can buy yourself into it, but originally that was part of the peerage. Okay, that was the individuals who deserved to be leaders because they connected back to other individuals historically through some lineage. Okay, we see things like, very important lineages that have a lot of relationships, like Queen Elizabeth of the UK today, and her relationships, link back in many different ways to parents. And you can see where the House of Windsor came along from King George V and Queen Mary union together, produced that. And anyway, it's the same. You see all of these carry importance. And of course, all these individuals in these lineages are all interconnected, right? We're not really showing them as highly interconnected here, but there's all sorts of related matings and pairings and things to build empires and to ensure empires maintain themselves and to work with various other forms to try to keep, alliances together that were important. Okay? So we had all that, and we had a realization that it wasn't just spontaneous generation, even though it took a while to scientifically prove it. We had other things. So you may remember we talked a little bit about preformationism, which does again come from the Greeks, right? Because the idea was that the male contributed a whole unit for the most part, and that just developed inside the female. Sure enough, we got a microscope, and first developed the microscopes that could be used. They looked got tired of looking at upside down Eves, so they looked at cork and looked at things, and then they figured, well, look at sperm. Sure enough, there was a little human, human alcles in there, a little thing. Then Malpighian, who was another scientist, said, "Oh no, there's something in the egg. You're totally wrong. Everything's in the egg." Well, of course, they weren't looking at complete units. They're simply looking at the cell structure. And so that didn't last very long. Once we got better equipment, we could see that there weren't any little humans wandering around inside of egg or sperm. But what other ideas came along? Well, we had pangenesis, right? The idea that, okay, we don't have whole little humans, but we've got these little parts, right? And those little parts move around through the bloodstream. They collect in reproductive organs. This helps us explain things like delayed sexual maturity. Okay, humans are one of the ones that the primates that really are sort of the longest in time that we have an adolescent period before we become reproductively functional. And so what was going on was taking a while to get, it's a big body, took a while to get all that stuff collected in there. And this led to things like supportive Lamarckianism and things that you probably talked about. Of course, the current theory, current ideas, current dogma is epigenesis. None of that's true. Okay, you don't get any body parts. You didn't get your dad's nose or mom's ears or anything else. You got genetic code. Genetic code is then used as a blueprint for cell division. Cell division, then they have differentiation. We'll talk about development later, and you end up with a whole complete new organ. You didn't take any little pieces of liver and make a new liver. You actually okay. But given all that, we still have this for us. What's going on important here is this idea that Darwin is in the middle of all this. Darwin is sitting there in the 1800s, causing massive consternation among religious groups and science groups and all sorts of things because he's proposing ideas about how things change over time and how this works. Okay, so that's where we want to kind of jump to now. We want to talk about how this played a role in modern genetics and human genetics, okay, and where all this came about. So I want to talk a little bit about the mathematical methods and a little bit about the biometry. And to do this, I will talk about this in part 2.